In July 1961, a 19-year-old girl emerged from a swimming pool at Cliveden, a country house in Buckinghamshire. She had no swimming costume. The water had been warm. The night air was cold. She reached for a towel. Two men stood at the pool's edge watching. One wore a dinner jacket. The other wore the easy confidence of a man who moved between worlds. Neither knew her name. Neither would forget her face. This is not a story about a scandal. It is a story about what happens when a person with no power walks into a room full of people with power, and the powerful decide what she means. It is a story about a girl who wanted only to swim, and about how the world punished her for it. She was born on the 22nd of February, 1942, in two converted railway carriages beside a gravel quarry in Uxbridge, Berkshire. The carriages had been a temporary arrangement that became permanent. Her mother, Julie, had come from a respectable family, the kind of family that did not speak of such things. Her father, Archibald, was a man who left. The carriages remained. The quarry was a landscape of chalk and dust. The railway line ran past the windows. Trains passed at night, shaking the thin walls. Christine learned early that the world was divided into those who stayed and those who left, and that the difference was not always a matter of choice. She learned to be still when the trains passed. She learned to make herself small. She learned to disappear. Her childhood was not unusual for post-war Britain. Rationing, austerity, the particular cold of an unheated carriage in winter, when the metal walls sweated with condensation and the windows frosted over from the inside. Her mother worked as a hairdresser, leaving early in the morning and returning late. Christine attended the local school. She was, by all accounts, an ordinary girl in an ordinary place, with the single distinction that she lived in a railway carriage, and everyone knew it. The other children knew. They made remarks. They asked questions. They understood, in the way that children understand such things, that Christine was different, not better, not worse, but marked by something that set her apart. She did not invite them to her home. She did not speak of the carriages. She simply endured the knowledge that she was, in some fundamental way, not like them. At 15, she came to London. The exact circumstances are unclear. The sources differ, as they do on most details of her early life. Some accounts suggest she ran away. Others suggest her mother sent her. What is certain is that she arrived in the capital with almost nothing: a small bag of clothes, a few pounds in her pocket, and a face that was beautiful enough to open doors. She found work as a model or a shop assistant, or both. The records are vague. She lived in a bedsit in Baker Street, a narrow room in a house full of narrow rooms, each one occupied by a young person trying to become something other than what they had been. She was young and beautiful, and in London in the 1950s that was a kind of currency. It could be exchanged for meals, for attention, for the possibility of a different life. She was also lonely. The city was vast and indifferent. The people she met were transient, here for a season, then gone. She had no family to anchor her. She had no friends who knew her before she became beautiful. She had only her own reflection in shop windows and the eyes of men who looked at her with desire or calculation or both. In 1958, she became pregnant. The father's name does not appear in any reliable source. Some accounts suggest he was a man she met at a party. Others suggest he was someone she worked for. The truth, if it was ever known, has been lost. She carried the child to term, working until the end, hiding the pregnancy beneath loose clothing. She told no one. She asked for help from no one. On the 17th of April, 1959, a son was born. He was healthy. He was perfect. He lived for 6 days. Christine never spoke his name in any interview that survives. In her memoirs, published decades later, she wrote only, "I think about him every day." She did not describe his appearance. She did not explain what had killed him. She did not say whether she had held him or whether she had been allowed to. She simply stated the fact of his existence and the fact of his death, and then moved on as though the words themselves were too heavy to carry for more than a moment. The child was buried. Christine remained in London. She had nowhere else to go. She had no money for a funeral. She had no family to mourn with her. She had only the knowledge that she had been a mother for 6 days, and that this knowledge would live in her body for the rest of her life. A few months after her son's death, in the summer of 1959, she came to Murray's Club on Beak Street in Soho. It was a nightclub of a particular kind, a place where beautiful young women stood motionless on a stage, posed as though they were sculptures or paintings. They were called tableaux vivants, a French term that meant living pictures. The women did not move. They did not speak. They simply stood naked or nearly naked and allowed themselves to be looked at. The club was not disreputable exactly. It was licensed. It was frequented by men of a certain class, businessmen, minor aristocrats, tourists with money and curiosity. The women were paid. They were not forced. And yet there was something profoundly strange about the arrangement, the reduction of a human being to an image, the transformation of a person into a thing. Christine was hired. She was 17 years old. She was beautiful. She was also, by her own account, entirely without understanding of what the arrangement meant or what it would cost her. She needed money. The club offered money. The logic was simple. She learned to be still. She learned to hold her body in a pose for hours, one arm raised, the other at her side, her head tilted at a particular angle. She learned to feel the weight of men's eyes without flinching. She learned to breathe shallowly so that her body would not move. She learned to disappear into her own image, to become a thing to be looked at rather than a person to be known. It was a skill she had been learning since childhood, in the railway carriages, in the schoolyard, in the bedsit on Baker Street. Now she was being paid for it. It was at Murray's that she met Stephen Ward. Ward was 52 years old, a man of considerable charm and considerable ambition. He was an osteopath by profession, a healer of backs, a man who worked with his hands on the bodies of the powerful. He treated cabinet ministers. He treated members of the royal family. He was, by all accounts, very good at what he did. His hands were skilled. His manner was reassuring. People trusted him with their pain. But he was also an artist. He drew portraits. He sketched the faces of the people he treated, capturing something in the line of the jaw or the set of the eyes that suggested not just what they looked like but who they were. His drawings were good. They were exhibited in galleries. They were sold to collectors. He had a gift for seeing people, or at least for seeing the surfaces of people, the masks they wore, the images they presented to the world. Ward was also a man who understood the value of beauty. He understood that beautiful young women attracted powerful men, and that powerful men were the currency in which the world of London society traded. He understood that a man with access to beautiful young women was a man who could move through rooms, who could make introductions, who could be useful. He saw Christine at Murray's and understood immediately what she was. Not a person, but a possibility. A bridge between worlds. A key that might open doors. He approached her. He was charming. He was interested. He was, by her account, the first person in her life who seemed to see her as something other than a body to be looked at. He asked her name, he asked her where she was from, he asked her what she wanted. No one had asked her these questions before. "She's extraordinary," he said to a friend, gesturing towards her. "She just doesn't know it yet." Whether he meant this kindly or calculatingly is impossible to determine. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. What is certain is that he offered her something she had never had, a way out of the tableau's vivants, a way into a world where she might be more than a silhouette, a way, or so it seemed, to become a person again. She accepted. Ward took her to his flat on Wimple Mews, a narrow street in Marylebone lined with converted townhouses. The flat was small but elegant, the home of a man with taste and money. The walls were painted in soft colours. The furniture was modern. There were books on the shelves and paintings on the walls. It was, to Christine, a glimpse of a world she had not known existed. He gave her a room. It was small, but it was hers. She had never had a room of her own before. She had never had a space that was entirely hers, where she could close the door and be alone. She spent the first night simply sitting on the bed, looking at the walls, unable to quite believe that this was real. He introduced her to his friends. They came to the flat in the evenings, artists, musicians, minor celebrities, men and women who moved through London's bohemian circles with the ease of people who belonged there. They were interesting. They were interested in interesting things. They talked about art and politics and philosophy. Christine listened. She said very little. She was learning. He took her to parties where she met people she had never imagined meeting. She met actors. She met writers. She met men in expensive suits who held power in ways she did not yet understand. She was introduced as a friend of Stephen's, which was vague enough to be mysterious and specific enough to grant her a kind of legitimacy. He clothed her. He took her to shops and bought her dresses, not the cheap dresses she had worn before, but expensive dresses made of good fabric, cut to fit her body perfectly. He bought her shoes. He bought her jewelry. He taught her how to wear these things, how to move in them, how to carry herself with the confidence of a woman who belonged in expensive clothes. He educated her. He recommended books. He took her to galleries. He explained paintings to her. He taught her the names of artists and composers and writers. He taught her how to talk about art, how to ask intelligent questions, how to move through cultural spaces without revealing that she had grown up in a railway carriage beside a gravel quarry. He showed her a world that existed beyond the gravel quarry and the railway carriages and the stage at Murray's. A world where beauty was valued, but where it was not the only thing that mattered. A world where a girl from nowhere could become someone. In return, he asked very little, or so it seemed. She was 19 years old. She had no family to protect her. She had no education, no money, no understanding of the rules that governed the world she had entered. She had only her beauty and her willingness to please. Ward understood this. He used it. But he also, by most accounts, cared for her. Not as a lover. He was not interested in her sexually, but as a creator cares for his creation. As a man cares for a beautiful thing that he has rescued from obscurity and brought into the light. The flat on Wimple Mews became her home. The parties became her life. The powerful men who came through the door became her education. She learned to move through rooms full of strangers. She learned to listen without speaking. She learned to be present without being intrusive. She learned to laugh at jokes she did not quite understand. She learned to accept compliments without blushing. She learned, in short, to be the kind of woman that powerful men wanted to be around. She did not yet understand that this education was also a kind of trap. She did not yet understand that the world she was entering had rules that were written in invisible ink, rules that she would break simply by existing in it. She did not yet understand that beauty, in the hands of powerful men, could be a weapon, not against them, but against her. She was simply grateful, grateful for the room, grateful for the clothes, grateful for the attention, grateful for the possibility that she might become someone other than the girl from the railway carriages. She did not know that gratitude in this world was a kind of debt, and that debts, eventually, must be paid. Cliveden sits on a chalk bluff above the Thames in Buckinghamshire, surrounded by formal gardens and ancient woodland. It is a place where a great deal of money has been spent over a great many years to keep the world at a comfortable distance. The house itself, Italianate, monumental, built by Charles Barry in 1851 for the Duke of Sutherland, had passed through several aristocratic hands before arriving in the possession of the Astor family. By 1961, it belonged to William Waldorf Astor, the third Viscount, a man of considerable wealth and considerable discretion. He did not live there permanently. He rented it out. The people who rented it were the kind of people who could afford to rent a house like Cliveden, the powerful, the wealthy, the well-connected. In the summer of 1961, the house was rented by a man named Profumo. John Profumo was the Secretary of State for War, one of the most powerful positions in the British government. He was 46 years old. He was married to Valerie Hobson, a former film star who had retired from acting to be a politician's wife, which required, if anything, a more demanding performance than any role she had played on screen. She was graceful. She was self-possessed. She was, by all accounts, entirely unaware of what her husband was doing. Stephen Ward knew Profumo. Ward knew everyone. He moved through London society with the ease of a man who was useful to powerful people. He treated their backs. He introduced them to beautiful women. He was discreet. He was charming. He was, in short, the kind of man that powerful men wanted to know. Ward brought Christine to Cliveden on the 8th of July, 1961. It was a weekend party. There were other guests, aristocrats, businessmen, minor celebrities. There was a swimming pool. There was champagne. There was the particular atmosphere of a place where the normal rules did not apply, where powerful people could do things they would not do in London, where discretion was assumed and consequences seemed impossible. Christine was 19 years old. She had never been to a place like Cliveden. She had never seen a swimming pool like this one, Olympic-sized, heated, surrounded by marble. She had never worn a swimming costume in front of powerful men. She had never felt so far from the railway carriages of her childhood. She swam. The water was warm. The night air was cool. She emerged from the pool, dripping, luminous under the July stars. She reached for a towel. John Profumo was watching. He was a handsome man, in the way that powerful men often are, not because of his features, but because of the confidence that came with power. He had been married for 15 years. He had a son. He had a career that was the envy of men half his age. He had everything a man in his position was supposed to want. He wanted Christine. What happened next is unclear. The sources differ. Some accounts suggest they spoke briefly by the pool. Others suggest they did not speak at all. What is certain is that within days, Profumo had arranged to see her alone. Within weeks, they were lovers. The affair lasted approximately 6 months. It was conducted with a kind of recklessness that suggests either supreme confidence or supreme stupidity, or perhaps both. Profumo would send his ministerial car to collect her from Wimpole Mews. They would meet in a flat in Marylebone. They would spend an hour together. The car would return her to the flat. No one, Profumo seemed to believe, would ever know. Christine, for her part, was not in love. She was grateful. She was flattered. She was also, by her own account, entirely passive in the arrangement. Profumo came. She received him. He left. She did not ask questions. She did not make demands. She simply accepted what was offered. He came, he spent an hour with me, and then he left, she said in an interview decades later. He never asked how I was. He never asked what I wanted. He never asked anything about me at all. I was simply there. That was all that was required. By the autumn of 1961, the affair was over. Profumo had grown cautious, or perhaps he had simply grown bored. The exact reason is not recorded. What is certain is that he stopped calling. The ministerial car stopped arriving. Christine was left with the knowledge that she had been the lover of the Secretary of State for War, and that this knowledge was worth nothing, could not be spoken of, could not be used, could not be acknowledged in any way. She was simply left. But by the time Profumo ended the affair, another man had already entered her life. His name was Yevgeny Ivanov. He was a Soviet naval attaché, which is to say, he was a spy. He was handsome, in a different way from Profumo. He was charming. He was interested in her. He was also, unbeknownst to Christine, interested in her primarily because of her connection to Profumo. The Cold War was at its height. The Soviet Union wanted to know what the British government was thinking. The British government wanted to know what the Soviet Union was thinking. Intelligence services on both sides were engaged in a constant game of espionage and counter-espionage. Ivanov had been sent to London to cultivate contacts in the British establishment. He had been instructed to find ways to access information, to develop relationships, to position himself as a useful man to know. He met Christine at a party at Ward's flat. Ward introduced them. Ward, it would later emerge, was not simply a man who knew everyone. Ward was also a man who was known by everyone, including MI5, the British Security Service. MI5 had identified Ward as a potential security risk. They had also identified him as potentially useful. They had, in short, recruited him as an informal asset. They asked him to report on his contacts. They asked him to introduce them to people. They asked him to be their eyes and ears in the bohemian circles of London. Ward agreed. Whether he did so willingly or under pressure is unclear. What is certain is that he introduced Ivanov to Christine, knowing that Ivanov was a Soviet intelligence officer and knowing that MI5 was watching. Ivanov was charming. He was attentive. He was interested in Christine in a way that Profumo had not been. He asked her questions. He listened to her answers. He seemed to care about her as a person, not simply as a body to be used. She fell in love with him, or believed she did. The distinction is perhaps not important. What is important is that she was vulnerable, and he exploited that vulnerability. What is important is that she was being used by at least 3 intelligence services simultaneously. MI5 using Ward to watch Ivanov, the GRU using Ivanov to reach Profumo, and Profumo's government using the entire apparatus of the state to protect itself. And Christine, at the center of this machinery, understood none of it. The affair with Ivanov lasted several months. It was more genuine than the affair with Profumo, or so it seemed. Ivanov took her to restaurants. He took her to parties. He introduced her to his friends. He spoke to her about his life, his family, his country. He seemed to see her as a person, not simply as a means to an end. But he was also, by his own later admission, using her. In his memoirs, published decades later in Moscow, Ivanov wrote, "She was beautiful. She was warm. She was also a bridge, a living, breathing bridge between a Soviet intelligence officer and a British cabinet minister. The GRU had instructed me to cultivate contacts in the British establishment. Christine was the most direct route I had found." In January 1962, Ivanov was recalled to Moscow. He left London and did not return. He and Christine never saw each other again. He would spend the rest of his life in a kind of professional twilight, neither punished nor promoted, a man whose moment of international notoriety had made him simultaneously famous and useless. He would die in 1994 in Moscow at the age of 67, his death attributed to complications of chronic alcoholism. He had drunk himself to death, slowly, methodically, with the discipline of a military man applying himself to self-destruction. But that was decades away. In 1962, Christine was simply abandoned. She was 20 years old. She had been the lover of the Secretary of State for War. She had been the lover of a Soviet intelligence officer. She had been, without knowing it, at the center of a Cold War espionage operation. And now she was alone again. By the spring of 1962, her social orbit had shifted. The powerful men had moved on. The parties at Wimple Mews continued, but they were different now. The men who came were not ministers or spies. They were musicians, artists, minor celebrities. Men who were interesting but not powerful, men who wanted to be around beautiful women, but who could not offer the kind of protection or advancement that Profumo and Ivanov had seemed to offer. It was during this period that she met Peter Rachman. Rachman was a property developer, a man who had come to London from Poland after the war and who had built a fortune by buying up slum housing in Notting Hill and renting it to immigrants at extortionate rates. He was brutal. He was ruthless. He was also, by all accounts, genuinely attracted to Christine. He was not using her, or at least not only using her. He wanted her. He pursued her. He offered her money, jewelry, a flat of her own. Christine accepted. She was tired of being dependent on Ward. She was tired of being passed from one powerful man to another. Rachman offered her independence, or the illusion of it. She moved into a flat that he provided. She became his mistress. She became, in the eyes of London society, a kept woman. Rachman was a man of violent temperament. He was known for his brutality towards his tenants. He was known for his ruthlessness in business. But towards Christine, he was, by most accounts, surprisingly gentle. He was jealous, intensely, obsessively jealous. He did not want her to see other men. He did not want her to go to parties without him. He wanted to possess her completely. Christine, for her part, was grateful for the attention. She was grateful for the money. She was grateful for the flat. She was grateful for the illusion that she had finally found a man who wanted her for herself, not for what she could provide or what she could access. But gratitude in this world was a kind of trap. By the autumn of 1962, Christine had begun to see other men. She had begun to go to parties without Rachman. She had begun to reclaim some small measure of independence. Rachman's jealousy intensified. He became possessive. He became violent. He threatened her. He threatened the men she saw. It was during this period that she met Johnny Edgecombe. Edgecombe was a Jamaican jazz musician, a man of considerable charm and considerable violence. He was handsome. He was talented. He was also, by all accounts, deeply unstable. He was prone to jealous rages. He was prone to violence. He carried a gun. He and Christine began an affair. It was brief and intense. It was also, almost immediately, a disaster. Rachman found out. He was furious. He confronted Christine. He confronted Edgecombe. He made threats. Edgecombe, in response, made counter-threats. The situation escalated rapidly into something that resembled a war between two men over the body of a woman who had never asked to be fought over. On the 27th of October, 1962, Lucky Gordon, another man in Christine's life, a Jamaican jazz singer who had been obsessed with her for months, attacked her with a razor at the Flamingo Club in Wardour Street. He slashed her face. He slashed her arms. He left her with 17 stitches and a scar that would mark her for the rest of her life. The attack was brutal. It was also, in a strange way, a kind of turning point. It brought Christine's private life into the public sphere. It brought the attention of the police. It brought the attention of the press. It brought the attention of the world. But worse was to come. On the 14th of December, 1962, Johnny Edgecombe came to the flat on Wimple Mews where Christine was staying. He was armed. He was angry. He fired a gun at the door. The bullets went through the wood. They could have killed anyone who was standing on the other side. No one was killed, but the shots were heard. The police were called. Edgecombe was arrested. And suddenly, the private life of Christine Keeler became a matter of public record. The newspapers began to ask questions. Who was this girl? Why were men shooting at doors because of her? What was her connection to the flat on Wimple Mews? Who was Stephen Ward? The machinery of scandal had begun to turn, and Christine, at its center, had no idea what was about to happen. The machinery of scandal moves slowly at first, then with terrifying speed. In the weeks following the shooting at Wimple Mews, the newspapers began to investigate. They sent reporters to Soho. They asked questions at Murray's club. They spoke to people who had been at parties at Ward's flat. They began to piece together a story. A girl, a swimming pool, a minister, a spy, a gun. The story was incomplete. The story was also, in its essentials, true. By March 1963, the story had reached Parliament. A backbench MP named George Whig stood up in the House of Commons and asked a question. He did not name Christine. He did not name Profumo. He spoke in careful, coded language about a security risk, about a minister who had been compromised, about a girl who had been the lover of both a British cabinet minister and a Soviet intelligence officer. I do not propose to name the minister, Whig said, his voice steady and deliberate. But I propose to say that the time has come when the rumours must be ended, one way or another. Either the minister must deny these allegations, or he must resign. The House fell silent. Everyone knew who Whig was talking about. Everyone understood what he was implying. The question hung in the air like a threat. 3 days later, on the 22nd of March, 1963, John Profumo stood up in the House of Commons and made a statement. He was pale. He was controlled. He was, by all accounts, terrified. There was no impropriety whatsoever in my acquaintance with Miss Keeler, he said. His voice did not waver. I have not at any time been connected with her in any way that could give rise to a security risk. It was a lie. Everyone in the house knew it was a lie, but it was a lie that had been carefully constructed. It was a lie that was technically defensible. It was a lie that, if it held, would protect not just Profumo, but the entire apparatus of the British establishment. For a moment, it seemed as though the lie might hold. But then the press began to investigate more deeply. They began to ask questions about Stephen Ward. They began to ask questions about the flat on Wimple Mews. They began to ask questions about the parties, the people, the connections. And they began to ask questions about Christine. Where was she? Why was she not speaking? What did she know? What had she seen? What had she done? The press found her. They offered her money. They offered her protection. They offered her the chance to tell her story. Christine, who had been silent for months, who had been hidden away by Ward and his friends, who had been told to say nothing and to trust no one, began to talk. She told the press about Profumo. She told them about the affair. She told them about the times he had come to see her. She told them about the way he had treated her, not with cruelty, but with indifference. She told them everything. The story broke on the front pages of every newspaper in Britain. The headline was simple: Minister's girlfriend tells all. The scandal exploded. Profumo's career was over. On the 5th of June 1963, he resigned from office. He resigned from Parliament. He resigned from public life. He disappeared. He would spend the next 43 years, no, 45 years, in a kind of self-imposed exile, doing charitable work, scrubbing floors at Toynbee Hall, raising funds for the disadvantaged. He would eventually be forgiven. He would eventually be honored. But in June 1963, he was simply destroyed. The government was in chaos. The Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, was under pressure to resign. The Conservative Party was in disarray. The scandal had revealed not just the indiscretion of one minister, but the corruption of an entire system, a system in which powerful men could do whatever they wanted, as long as they were careful enough not to get caught. But the scandal was not finished. It had only just begun. Stephen Ward was arrested on the 8th of June, 1963. He was charged with living off immoral earnings, a charge that was, in essence, an accusation that he had been a pimp. The charge was absurd. Ward had never taken money from Christine or from any of the women he knew. But the charge was also, in a strange way, perfect. It allowed the establishment to blame Ward for everything. It allowed them to say that the scandal was not the fault of the system, but the fault of one man, a man who had corrupted innocent girls and used them for his own purposes. Ward's trial began on the 22nd of July, 1963. It was a spectacle. The courtroom was packed. The press was everywhere. The trial was, in essence, a trial not of Ward, but of the entire scandal. A trial of Profumo, of Ivanov, of the Cold War, of the British establishment itself. Christine was called to testify. She was 21 years old. She was terrified. She was also, by her own account, under intense pressure from the police to say certain things and not to say other things. The police wanted her to testify that Ward had forced her into prostitution. The police wanted her to testify that Ward had taken money from her. The police wanted her to testify in a way that would support the charge against Ward. She testified. She said what the police wanted her to say. She said that Ward had forced her to sleep with men. She said that Ward had taken money from her. She said that Ward had used her. Later, she would say that she had been coerced into giving this testimony. She would say that the police had pressured her. She would say that she had been terrified and confused and had simply said what she was told to say. But in the courtroom, In July 1963, she said what the establishment needed her to say. Mandy Rice Davies, another girl who had been part of Ward's circle, was also called to testify. She was asked about her relationship with Ward. She was asked about the men she had known. She was asked about the money she had received. And when she was asked whether she had slept with a particular lord, a man who had denied the allegation, she gave an answer that would become immortal. Well, he would, wouldn't he? 4 words. That was all it took. 4 words that captured, in a single phrase, the entire hypocrisy of the British establishment. 4 words that suggested that powerful men always denied such things, that their denials meant nothing, that the truth was irrelevant as long as you had the power to make people believe your lies. The courtroom erupted. The press seized on the phrase. It became the defining moment of the trial. It became the thing that people remembered. It became, in a strange way, more important than the actual verdict. On the 31st of July, 1963, Stephen Ward took an overdose of barbiturates. He was found unconscious in his flat. He was rushed to hospital. He died 3 days later, on the 3rd of August, 1963, without regaining consciousness. He left a note. It read, "I am sorry to disappoint the vultures." The vultures, as it turned out, were not disappointed. They simply moved on to the next carcass. Ward's funeral took place on the 16th of August. 6 people attended. 6. A man who had sketched members of the royal family, who had treated the backs of prime ministers, who had dined at the finest tables in London, was buried with 6 mourners. His grave in an obscure cemetery remained unmarked for years. The trial continued without him. The verdict was guilty. Ward was convicted of living off immoral earnings. He was sentenced to 12 months in prison. He would never serve the sentence. He was dead. But the machinery of scandal was not finished. It had turned its attention to Christine. In December 1963, Christine was charged with perjury. She had lied under oath, the prosecution said. She had given false testimony. She had committed a crime. She was convicted. She was sentenced to 9 months in prison. She served 6 months in Holloway Prison, a Victorian fortress in North London where women were held in conditions of extraordinary brutality. She was 21 years old. She had been the lover of a cabinet minister. She had been the lover of a Soviet spy. She had been used by the police. She had been used by the press. She had been used by the establishment. And now she was in prison. The other prisoners knew who she was. They knew her story. They knew that she had been at the center of the scandal that had brought down a government. Some of them were sympathetic. Some of them were hostile. Most of them simply stared at her, trying to reconcile the girl in front of them with the image they had seen in the newspapers. She was released in June 1964. She was 22 years old. She had a criminal record. She had no job. She had no prospects. She had only the knowledge that she had been destroyed by forces beyond her control and that the world would never forgive her for it. But before the trial, before the prison, before the destruction, there was the photograph. In 1963, a photographer named Lewis Morley was commissioned to take a portrait of Christine Keeler. The circumstances are unclear. Some accounts suggest that a magazine had commissioned the photograph. Others suggest that it was taken for a book. What is certain is that Morley was a skilled photographer, a man who understood light and shadow and the way that a camera could capture not just what a person looked like, but who they were. He asked Christine to pose. He asked her to sit on a chair. The chair was a Jacobsen 3107, a piece of Danish design so clean and precise that it looked as though it had been drawn rather than built. The chair was modern. The chair was elegant. The chair was, in a strange way, perfect. He asked her to remove her clothes. She did. He asked her to sit astride the chair, her arms resting on the curved back, her body exposed. She did. He asked her to look into the camera. She did. And in that moment, something extraordinary happened. The camera captured not just her body, but her essence. It captured her vulnerability and her strength. It captured her youth and her exhaustion. It captured the fact that she was, simultaneously, a person and an object, a living, breathing human being and a silhouette, a shape, an image. The photograph was extraordinary. It was also, almost immediately, controversial. It was published in a magazine. It was reproduced in newspapers. It was shown in galleries. It became, within weeks, the most famous photograph of the 1960s. It became the image that defined the scandal. It became the image that defined Christine Keeler. She was asked about the photograph more often than she was asked about her children. She was asked about the photograph more often than she was asked about her life. She was asked about the photograph more often than she was asked about anything else. The photograph had become more real than the person in it. The image had replaced the woman. I was the background in my own life, she would say decades later, when asked about the photograph. The chair was more important than me. The image was more important than the person. I was simply the thing that made the image possible. The chair itself would survive. It would be preserved. It would be placed in the Victoria and Albert Museum, in the gallery devoted to 20th century design. A small label beside it would identify the maker and the date. Nowhere on the label would it mention the woman who once sat astride it, naked, her arms resting on the curved back, her eyes meeting the lens of Lewis Morley's camera. The chair would have a history. The woman who made it famous would not. The years that followed do not lend themselves to narrative. There are no dramatic scenes, no courtroom confrontations, no bullets indoors. There is only the slow, grinding, relentless weight of a life lived under the wrong name. She was released from Holloway Prison in June 1964. She was 22 years old. She had served 6 months of a 9-month sentence. She had been a model prisoner, quiet, obedient, invisible. The other inmates had largely left her alone. The guards had treated her with a kind of wary respect. She had survived, but survival was not the same as living. She emerged from the prison gates into a world that had moved on without her. The scandal had faded from the front pages. The government had stabilized. Profumo had disappeared into his charitable work. Ward was dead. Ivanov was in Moscow. The machinery of scandal had found new targets, new victims, new stories to consume. But Christine remained. She remained in the public consciousness as a symbol of something, though no one could quite agree on what. She was a symbol of the corruption of the establishment. She was a symbol of the vulnerability of young women. She was a symbol of the power of the press. She was a symbol of the consequences of beauty in a world ruled by powerful men. She was also, quite simply, unemployable. No respectable employer would hire her. No respectable man would marry her. No respectable institution would accept her. She was marked. She was tainted. She was, in the eyes of the world, a fallen woman, and in 1964, being a fallen woman meant being cast out of society entirely. She took whatever work she could find. She worked in a shop. She worked as a hostess in a nightclub. She worked as a model for photographers who were interested in her notoriety rather than her talent. She worked, in short, at the margins of respectability, doing jobs that no one else wanted to do for money that barely kept her alive. She also began to marry. In October 1965, she married a man named James Livermore. He was a hairdresser. He was kind. He was also, by all accounts, entirely unaware of who she was or what her history was. Or perhaps he was aware and did not care. The records are unclear. The marriage lasted less than a year. It ended in divorce in 1966. The reasons are not recorded. What is certain is that she was married and then unmarried, and that this cycle would repeat itself several times over the next decade. In 1971, she married again, this time to a man named John Profumo, no relation to the minister, though the coincidence of the name was cruel. This marriage lasted longer. It lasted until 1977, when it ended in divorce on the 27th of May. By this time, she had 2 sons. She had named them after the men she had loved, or believed she had loved. One was named after Profumo. One was named after Ivanov. She had given her children the names of the men who had used her, as though by doing so she could reclaim some small measure of power over her own history. But the children grew up knowing who their mother was. They grew up knowing that she was famous. They grew up knowing that she was infamous. They grew up knowing that their mother was the girl in the photograph, the girl on the chair, the girl who had brought down a government. One day, when her son was a teenager, he came home from school. Someone at work or at school, the account varies, had shown him a newspaper, an old newspaper, from 1963. He was in it. His mother was in it. The headline was large. The photograph was unmistakable. "Mum," he said, "why are you in this newspaper?" She did not know what to say. She did not know how to explain to her child that she had been famous for being used, that she had been destroyed for being beautiful, that the world had decided what she meant, and that her own understanding of herself was irrelevant. "I was young," she said finally. "I made mistakes. People were cruel." It was not an explanation. It was simply the truth, stated as plainly as possible. Her son looked at the photograph. He looked at his mother. He looked back at the photograph. "The worst thing," he said, "is that my brothers paid for it. We all paid for it. You paid for it. And the men who did it, they're fine. They're all fine." He was right. By 1975, John Profumo had been rehabilitated. He had been given a CBE, a Commander of the Order of the British Empire, in recognition of his charitable work. He had been forgiven. He had been honored. He had been restored to respectability. Christine had not been forgiven. She had not been honored. She had not been restored to anything. She had simply been forgotten, or rather, she had been remembered only as a symbol, only as an image, only as the girl on the chair. The years passed. The decades passed. The world changed. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Internet arrived. The scandal of 1963 became history. It became a footnote in books about the 1960s. It became a subject for documentaries. It became a story that people told about a different time, a different world, a different Britain. But Christine remained. She remained in the margins. She remained poor. She remained, in the eyes of many, infamous. She worked. She survived. She raised her children. She lived in a series of small flats in unfashionable parts of London. She lived quietly. She lived without drawing attention to herself. She lived, in short, the life of a woman who had been destroyed by the world and who had somehow managed to keep living anyway. And then, in the 1980s, something unexpected happened. The scandal was rediscovered. A new generation discovered the story. They discovered the photograph. They discovered Christine. And they began to ask questions that the previous generation had not asked. Who was this girl? What had happened to her? Where was she now? What had her life been like after the scandal? Journalists began to seek her out. Filmmakers began to develop projects about the scandal. Television producers began to commission documentaries. The story of Christine Keeler became fashionable again. It became, in a strange way, cool. It became the subject of cultural fascination. In 1988, a quarter of a century after the scandal, Christine appeared on a television program called After Dark. She sat in a studio with other guests. She talked about her life. She talked about the scandal. She talked about what it had been like to be at the center of something so enormous, so destructive, so beyond her control. She was articulate. She was intelligent. She was also, by all accounts, exhausted. She had been telling this story for 25 years. She had been explaining herself for 25 years. She had been defending herself for 25 years, and she was tired. But she continued to speak. She continued to tell her story. She continued to insist that she was a person, not simply an image. She continued to insist that what had happened to her mattered. She continued to insist that the world had been unfair to her and that this unfairness should be acknowledged. In 1992, she published her memoirs. The book was called Secrets and Lies. It was a brutal, honest account of her life. It was a book in which she named names. It was a book in which she described in detail what had happened to her. It was a book in which she refused to be silent any longer. The book was not a bestseller. It was not widely reviewed. It was not, in the eyes of the literary establishment, a significant work. But it was important. It was important because it was her voice. It was important because it was her truth. It was important because it refused to allow the scandal to be told only from the perspective of the powerful men who had been at its center. In the book, she wrote about Profumo. She wrote about Ivanov. She wrote about Ward. She wrote about the police who had coerced her. She wrote about the press who had exploited her. She wrote about the establishment that had destroyed her. She wrote, in short, about the machinery that had ground her down. But she also wrote about herself. She wrote about her childhood in the railway carriages. She wrote about her son who had lived for 6 days. She wrote about her work at Murray's Club. She wrote about the men she had loved. She wrote about the men who had used her. She wrote about the difference between the two and about how difficult it was to tell them apart. She wrote about the photograph. She wrote about how the image had replaced the person. She wrote about how she had become, in the eyes of the world, simply a silhouette, a shape, a symbol, a thing to be looked at rather than a person to be known. I was the background in my own life, she wrote. The chair was more important than me. The image was more important than the person. I was simply the thing that made the image possible. And when the image was no longer useful, I was discarded. I was thrown away. I was forgotten. In 2006, John Profumo died. He was 91 years old. He had spent the last 45 years of his life doing charitable work. He had scrubbed floors at Toynbee Hall. He had raised money for the disadvantaged. He had, by most accounts, genuinely tried to atone for what he had done. He had been forgiven by history. He had been honored by the establishment. He had died a respected man. Christine attended his funeral. She did not speak. She simply stood at the back of the church and watched as the great and the good paid their respects to a man who had destroyed her life and then spent decades being forgiven for it. After the funeral, a journalist approached her. "How do you feel?" The journalist asked. Christine looked at the journalist. She looked at the church. She looked at the people filing out, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries. "He got to live a full life," she said. "He got to be forgiven. He got to be honored. He got to die respected. I got to be destroyed. I got to be forgotten. I got to spend the rest of my life trying to explain myself to people who didn't care. And now he's dead, and everyone's saying what a good man he was, what a charitable man he was, what a reformed man he was, and no one's saying what he did to me. No one's saying that he destroyed me. No one's saying that he used me and then threw me away." She paused. "That's the real scandal," she said. "Not what happened in 1963, but what happened after. The fact that he was forgiven and I was not. The fact that he was honored and I was not. The fact that he died respected and I will die infamous. That's the real scandal." In 2013, the BBC broadcast a television drama called The Profumo Affair. It told the story of the scandal. It told the story of Christine. It told the story of Profumo and Ward and Ivanov. It told the story of the machinery that had destroyed them all. Christine watched the drama. She watched an actress play her. She watched her own life being performed on screen. She watched the scandal being told again, for what must have been the 100th time. She was 81 years old. She had lived through the scandal. She had lived through the trial. She had lived through the prison. She had lived through the decades of poverty and obscurity. She had lived through the rediscovery of the scandal. She had lived through the documentaries and the books and the television dramas. She had lived through all of it, and she was still alive. In an interview, she was asked what she thought of the drama. "It's strange," she said, "to see your life performed like that, to see an actress playing you, to see the scandal being told again. I've told this story so many times. I've explained myself so many times, and yet it never seems to be enough. The world still wants to know. The world still wants to understand, but I'm not sure there's anything left to understand. I'm not sure there's anything left to explain." She paused. She looked away from the camera. "I was 19 years old," she said. "I was beautiful. I was also stupid. I was naive. I was vulnerable. I was all of those things. And the world punished me for it. The world destroyed me for it. And I've spent the rest of my life trying to understand why, trying to understand what I did wrong, trying to understand how I could have done things differently." She paused again. "But I don't think I did anything wrong," she said finally. "I think the world did something wrong. I think the men who used me did something wrong. I think the police who coerced me did something wrong. I think the press who exploited me did something wrong. I think the establishment that destroyed me did something wrong. And I think the world should acknowledge that. I think the world should say, we were wrong. We treated you unfairly. We destroyed you. We should not have done that." But the world did not say that. The world continued to tell the story of the scandal. The world continued to tell the story of Christine. But the world did not apologize. The world did not acknowledge its wrongdoing. The world simply continued to consume the story, to digest it, to make it part of its own mythology. And Christine continued to live. She continued to survive. She continued to insist that she was a person, not simply an image. She continued to tell her story, year after year, decade after decade. On the 4th of December 2017, at the age of 75, Christine Keeler died. She died of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, at the Princess Royal University Hospital in Farnborough. She died quietly. She died without fanfare. She died, in short, the way she had lived for the last 54 years, in the margins, largely unnoticed, largely forgotten. The obituaries were respectful. They acknowledged her role in the scandal. They acknowledged the unfairness of what had happened to her. They acknowledged that she had been destroyed by forces beyond her control. But they also, in many cases, reduced her to the scandal. They reduced her to the image. They reduced her to the girl on the chair. She was more than that. She was a person. She was a mother. She was a survivor. She was a woman who had endured extraordinary cruelty and who had somehow managed to keep living. She was a woman who had refused to disappear entirely. She was a woman who had insisted, year after year, decade after decade, that she was a person, not simply an image. And now she was gone. The chair itself survives. Model 3107, designed by the Danish architect Arne Jacobsen in 1957, a piece of furniture so clean and precise that it looks as if it were drawn rather than built. It stands today in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, in the gallery devoted to 20th century design. A small label beside it identifies the maker and the date. Nowhere on the label does it mention the woman who once sat astride it, naked, her arms resting on the curved back, her eyes meeting the lens of Lewis Morley's camera. The chair has a history. The woman who made it famous does not. In the National Portrait Gallery, a few miles away, hangs another relic, a portrait of Christine Keeler drawn by Stephen Ward himself, presented to the gallery in 1984. The eyes in the drawing are watchful, the mouth slightly open as though she is about to speak. The label beneath it is simple, Christine Keeler by Stephen Ward. Two names, both dead, both in different ways destroyed by the same machinery. The chair and the drawing are the only physical objects that remain. Everything else, the pool at Cliveden, the flat on Wimpole Mews, the courtroom at the Old Bailey, the prison cell in Holloway, has been altered or demolished or simply forgotten. What endures is the image, a young woman on a chair, the silhouette that replaced the person. In July 1961, a 19-year-old girl from two converted railway carriages beside a gravel quarry in Berkshire stepped out of a swimming pool in someone else's garden. She had no swimming costume. She had no money. She had no education, no connections, no family name that opened doors. She did not know that the man in the dinner jacket was the Secretary of State for War. She did not know that the handsome Russian was an intelligence officer. She did not know the rules of the world she had walked into. She knew only that the water had been warm and the night air cold, and that she had nowhere else to go. She just wanted to swim. The world never forgave her for it. But what does it mean to forgive? What does it mean to remember? What does it mean to tell a story again and again for 54 years, and to have the world listen but not understand? Christine Keeler's story is not a story about scandal. It is a story about power. It is a story about what happens when a person with no power walks into a room full of people with power, and the powerful decide what she means. It is a story about how an image can replace a person. It is a story about how a silhouette can become more real than the woman who cast it. It is also a story about forgiveness, or rather, about the absence of forgiveness. About how some people are forgiven and some people are not. about how John Profumo, who used her and then destroyed her, was eventually honored and respected, about how Stephen Ward, who exploited her, but also, in his way, cared for her, died in disgrace, about how Christine herself, who did nothing wrong except be young and beautiful and vulnerable, was destroyed and never forgiven. The machinery of scandal grinds on. It grinds on in books. It grinds on in films. It grinds on in television programs. It grinds on in the collective memory of the British people. It grinds on as a story about power and corruption and the vulnerability of young women. It grinds on as a story about the 1960s, about a moment when the old order was crumbling and the new order had not yet been established. But what of the people at the center of the scandal? What had become of them? John Profumo died in 2006 at the age of 91. He had spent the last 45 years of his life doing charitable work. He had scrubbed floors at Toynbee Hall. He had raised money for the disadvantaged. He had, by most accounts, genuinely tried to atone for what he had done. He had been forgiven by history. He had been honored by the establishment. He had died a respected man. Stephen Ward died in 1963 at the age of 50. He died in disgrace. He died believing that he had been betrayed by everyone, by the police, by the press, by the establishment, by the girls he had tried to help. His grave remained unmarked for decades. It was only in recent years that people began to question whether he had been treated fairly, whether the charges against him had been just, whether he had been made a scapegoat for the sins of more powerful men. Yevgeny Ivanov died in 1994 in Moscow at the age of 67. He had drunk himself to death. He had spent the last 30 years of his life in a kind of professional twilight, neither punished nor promoted, a man whose moment of international notoriety had made him simultaneously famous and useless. He had become an alcoholic. He had become a ghost. He had become, in the end, irrelevant. Lucky Gordon died in 2017 at the age of approximately 85. The exact date of his death is not widely recorded. He had lived a long life. He had lived it largely out of the public eye. He had become, like so many of the people involved in the scandal, a footnote to history. Mandy Rice Davies lived until 2014. She had become an actress. She had become a businesswoman. She had become, in many ways, more successful than Christine. She had managed to transform her notoriety into a kind of celebrity. She had managed to move beyond the scandal. She had managed to build a life that was not entirely defined by what had happened in 1963. But Christine remained. Christine remained in the margins. Christine remained poor. Christine remained, in the eyes of many, defined entirely by the scandal. And yet, there was something else. There was something that the scandal had not destroyed. There was something that remained intact despite everything. There was her voice. There was her intelligence. There was her refusal to disappear entirely. There was her insistence, year after year, decade after decade, that she was a person, not simply an image. The photograph by Lewis Morley has become iconic. It has been reproduced millions of times. It has been shown in galleries. It has been analyzed by art historians. It has been discussed in seminars. It has become, in many ways, more famous than the woman in it. But what does the photograph show? What does it mean? On one level, it shows a young woman naked, sitting on a chair. It shows her vulnerability. It shows her youth. It shows her beauty. It shows her as an object to be looked at. But on another level, it shows something else. It shows a woman who is looking directly at the camera. It shows a woman who is not ashamed. It shows a woman who is not hiding. It shows a woman who is, in a strange way, powerful. It shows a woman who is claiming her own image, her own body, her own sexuality. Or does it? Or is that simply what we want to see? Is that simply what we want to believe? The truth is that the photograph is ambiguous. It can be read in multiple ways. It can be read as an image of exploitation. It can be read as an image of empowerment. It can be read as an image of vulnerability. It can be read as an image of strength. It can be read as all of these things simultaneously. And that ambiguity is, perhaps, the most important thing about it. Because the ambiguity reflects the ambiguity of Christine's own life, the ambiguity of what happened to her, the ambiguity of whether she was a victim or a participant, whether she was exploited or complicit, whether she was destroyed or simply revealed. The truth is that she was all of these things. She was a victim of powerful men who used her. She was also a participant in her own story, making choices, even if those choices were constrained by circumstances beyond her control. She was exploited. She was also, in some ways, complicit in her own exploitation. She was destroyed. She was also, in some ways, revealed as a person, revealed as a woman, revealed as someone who had survived extraordinary cruelty and refused to be silenced.